I'm on page 502, and this is screencast number 3 for Unit 9, Lesson 1. How does energy flow through an ecosystem? In an ecosystem, energy flows from one organism to another. In a pond, algae are producers that get their energy from the sun. When a small fish eats algae, energy flows from the algae to the fish. When a large fish eats the small fish, energy flows from the small fish to the large fish. When an osprey eats the large fish, energy flows from the large fish to the osprey. The energy flow is shown using a simple model called a food chain. A food chain uses arrows to show how energy flows from one organism to the next. A food chain for the pond ecosystem described would start with algae, and it would look something like this. Algae, and then the arrow points to the small fish because the energy from the algae is transferred to the small fish. And then the energy from the small fish is transferred to the large fish when the large fish eats the small fish. And then the energy is transferred to the osprey when the osprey eats the large fish. At each link of a food chain, some of the energy is lost to the environment as heat. Some energy is used by the organism to fuel life processes. And really, only about 10% of the energy that's available at one link in the food chain passes up to the next organism. Okay? And that's because if you think about it, how many pounds of food have you eaten in your life? Well, many times your weight. But, or, if you don't want to talk about you, but let's say an antelope grazing on the prairie. How many, pounds of grass has it eaten in the course of its lifetime? A whole lot. But if that antelope is killed and eaten by a predator, say a cheetah or a lion or something like that, then only the energy that's been stored in the tissues of the antelope itself is able to be transferred to the lion or cheetah or whatever that killed it. So it's only the energy that was stored within the tissues of that animal. The rest of the energy that was broken down from the food that the antelope ate over the course of its life went toward, maintaining a warm body temperature and towards the energy required for digestion and to make your heart keep beating and all of this other stuff. So only a small percentage of the energy at one level actually gets transferred up to the next level. All right, how do food webs show feeding relationships? Okay, you may eat many different things each day. Organisms in an ecosystem may also eat more than one type of food. A food web is a model that shows the many feeding relationships in an ecosystem. A food web is made up of many food chains. Okay, and it's usually better to show the energy flow in an ecosystem through a food web because most of the time, most of your organisms eat more than just one thing. So a food chain really doesn't do the trick. Okay, so look at the food web shown here. Notice that the arrows point toward each organism that is getting energy. In this food web, most organisms get energy from several different sources. Producers form the base of most food webs. Most producers get energy from the sun. Okay, and number 16 down at the bottom has basically just been answered for you. What type of organism forms the base of most food webs? And those are producers. Okay. If you look, there is a little drawing that I did on the side of page 502. It's not the best drawing in the world, but hopefully it'll help you get the point. When you start reading a food web, please understand that the arrow always points to the eater. It always points to the organism that is doing the eating. Okay, so I don't know, these poor little guys are being eaten by this big guy. Okay, so the arrow points to where the energy is going, to who is doing the eating. So this guy is eating these guys. Okay, in the food web that we've got over here, for instance, the yellow perch is eating the snail because the snail gets gobbled up. by the yellow perch. The energy in the snail is going to get transferred to this yellow perch. Well, the yellow perch can get eaten by the rainbow trout. The yellow perch can get eaten by the walleye, by the river otter, okay? So the energy contained in the yellow perch would get transferred to whoever is eating the yellow perch. Okay, so the arrow always points to the eater, the one doing the eating. And that's really important to keep in mind when you start reading food webs. So let's just look at this particular food web, and let me ask you a couple of questions about it. All right, hang on. Okay, down at the bottom, that's the base of the food web, although they don't have to draw it from bottom to top, but they usually do. What are the producers in this food web? Well, there are these guys, diatoms, which are sort of simple, little teeny tiny plant-like organisms. There's green algae. Over here, sort of out of the picture, are a couple of plants, lake sedge and cattails. Okay, those are all producers in this ecosystem. Let's look further at the food web. Who does the crayfish compete with for food? All right, here's the crayfish. Well, if you look, the crayfish likes to eat diatoms, but the crayfish is not the only one eating diatoms. So the crayfish has to compete with the snail and has to compete with the mayfly for this resource, because all three of these guys are wanting to eat diatoms. So crayfish compete with both snails and the mayfly in order to eat the diatoms, which is the crayfish's main food source, apparently. Okay. Another question. Look at the food web and figure out what kind of consumer is the mallard. The mallard is right here. It's this duck. And if you look, this mallard is getting energy from two different places. It's getting energy from the lake sedge, and it's getting energy from the cattail. Both of these are plants, which makes the mallard a herbivore, meaning it only eats plants. Who does the rainbow trout have to compete with for yellow perch? Okay, notice that the rainbow trout is only getting energy from the yellow perch. But the rainbow trout is not the only organism that's eating the yellow perch. Okay, the yellow perch is being eaten by the river otter. The yellow perch is being eaten by the osprey. The yellow perch is being eaten by the rainbow trout. But it's also being eaten by the walleye. Okay, so who does the rainbow trout have to compete with for the yellow perch? Well, the rainbow trout has to compete with whoever else is trying to eat the yellow perch, and that's going to be the osprey, the otter, and the walleye. Now, consider this. What if there weren't any more yellow perch? Okay, so you take this guy out of the picture. Well, what is going to happen to some of the other organisms as a result? What would happen, for instance, to the walleye? I think the walleye is going to be in bad trouble, and here's why. According to this food web, the only thing that the walleye is eating is yellow perch. And if there are no more yellow perch, we may not have walleye for very long either. What about the rainbow trout? Well, the rainbow trout is going to be in the same kind of trouble because, according to the food web, yellow perch is the only thing that the rainbow trout is eating. Well, what about the otter? The otter is not going to be in great shape either, because if the yellow perch is gone, that's one food source that's gone. And if the yellow perch is gone, that probably means that the rainbow trout's going to be gone pretty soon too. That's another of the otter's food source. There's no more yellow perch. That means that there's probably not going to be any more walleye either, which is another food source for the otter. Now, the otter still has one more food source, which is the crayfish. But the otter is probably not going to be in really good shape either, because most of its food resources have disappeared. All because the yellow perch went away. Well, what about the osprey? Well, the osprey is going to be in really bad shape because the only two things that the osprey eats is the yellow perch, which is no longer there, and the rainbow trout, which is not going to be there either because the rainbow trout eats the yellow perch. So those two food sources go away, and the osprey is left in really bad shape. All right. Well, if there's no more yellow perch, what's going to happen to the mallard? Well, the mallard might be okay. And why? Because the mallard is not depending on the yellow perch for food. The mallard is eating plant material. So the mallard will probably be okay. What's going to happen to the snails, do you think, if there's no more yellow perch? Well, the snails are only being eaten by the yellow perch. And remember, since there are no more yellow perch, we can probably assume that there's going to be a proliferation of snails, meaning that there's going to be a whole lot of snails now because there's no predator to eat them, okay? So if you take one thing out of the food web, it's going to drastically change many other organisms and whether they are able to find the food resources that they need, etc. So, having one species in trouble can really mess up your entire food web in some cases. All right, so let's take a look at our next little bit. All right, I'm on page 504. What are the different types of symbiotic relationships? Well, symbiosis is a relationship in which two organisms live in close association with one another. They depend on each other, or one depends on the other, or what have you. A symbiotic relationship may involve food, shelter, protection, or other needs. Symbiotic relationships can be helpful, neutral, or harmful to one or both of the organisms in the relationship. Symbiotic relationships include mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So let's talk about those three very briefly. Mutualism is a relationship that's positive for both organisms that are involved. And there's a picture of a bat and a flower. The bat and the flower both benefit from this mutualistic relationship because the bat is getting food and all of the nectar and pollen and whatnot that gets stuck to its face as it goes from flower to flower helps the flower with its reproductive stuff because it's spreading the pollen everywhere. Okay, so they both receive a benefit. That's mutualism. It's mutually beneficial. Then we have commensalism, which is a relationship that's positive for one of the organisms but has no real effect on the other. It doesn't really make a difference for one of them. And then parasitism is a relationship that's positive for one and negative for the other. In parasitism, the one that is benefiting from the relationship is the parasite, and the one that is being harmed by the relationship is the host. You can think of, for instance, a tick is a parasite. It sucks the blood off of a dog or a deer or what have you, and typically doesn't kill the organism, but enough ticks living on a dog or a deer is going to compromise that animal's health. Okay, so a parasite benefits, but the host is harmed. Okay. Let's look at, real quickly, our notes that'll wrap up this first lesson. All right, we have food chain. Just a reminder that uses arrows to show how energy flows from one organism to the next. Only about 10% of the energy gets passed to the next level because, remember, it's only the energy that was stored in the tissues of the organism that got eaten. A food web is more accurate because it shows the many feeding relationships in an ecosystem. Okay, basically it's showing you many interconnected food chains. Remember, please, that producers form the base or the starting point of most food chains, or food webs. And then we have our three types of symbiotic relationships. Mutualism, which helps both organisms. Commensalism helps one without harming the other. And then parasitism, which helps one, the parasite, but harms the other, which is the host.